Hello everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon when you are watching this video lecture. In the earlier sessions related to the head of income capital gains, we discussed about charging section 45 and then 46.1 and then 47 as well as section 2 subsection 47 as well, and 48 computation of capital gains, 49 cost of acquisition under different circumstances. So in this series, let us continue with a few more provisions of this chapter today, starting with section 50, which is something that we already know, nothing new here, because similar thing has been already discussed under the chapter PGBP. While calculating depreciation under section 32, the instances where the short-term capital gain or short-term capital loss can arise in relation to depreciable assets has already been discussed there. That is just being repeated here. As far as provision is concerned, there is nothing new. So, let us quickly go through this section 50 and then move on to other sections. In case of depreciable assets, cost of acquisition and cost of improvement put together, there is no special thing, is aggregate of, it is the total of the WDV of the block of assets at the beginning of the year and actual cost of any asset falling within the block acquired during the year. That is the cost of acquisition and cost of improvement put together. That means sale proceeds will be naturally taken first as full value of consideration. Expenses in connection with transfer can be deducted so that we get net sale consideration. From that, what should we deduct in order to ascertain capital gains or losses? From the sale of depreciable assets, we need to deduct opening WDV of the assets in that block and also deduct fresh additions that happened during the year in relation to that particular block. So what are the possibilities here? The possibilities are, yes, there could be a short-term capital gain or even a short-term capital loss. When there can be a short-term capital gain? First point, when the entire block of the depreciable asset is transferred, in that case, there could be a gain also and loss also. Why? Because the block itself does not exist at the end of the period. There is no depreciation that is possible at all, since the entire block has been already transferred. But if the full value of consideration is more than the WDV of the block at the beginning of the year plus assets acquired during the year, then there will be a short-term capital gain. And vice versa, if there is a full value of consideration less than the cost of acquisition and cost of improvement, then there will be short-term capital loss. So in case of depreciable assets, either there will be depreciation, that is at the end of the period there will be closing depreciable amount of WDV, or if that block itself is not existing, then there could be a possibility of both short-term capital gain or short-term capital loss, as the case may be. What if when a part of the block of depreciable asset is sold? Then the situation of short-term capital gain only will happen because only part of the block has been sold. Then there is a possibility of short-term capital gain, that too when, if the full value of consideration exceeds the cost of acquisition and cost of improvement. What is cost of acquisition, cost of improvement? In this case is always the same, that is opening WDV plus assets acquired during the period. So if only part of the block of depreciable asset is transferred, then there will be only a possibility of either a short-term capital gain or depreciation itself. Short-term capital gain will be there when full value of consideration is more than COA and COI. And what if it is less than COA and COI? Then there is no capital gain loss at all. That will be eligible for depreciation under section 32. So these are the only possibilities that can arise from depreciable assets. Broadly speaking, 4 possibilities. One possibility is depreciation. Second possibility is short-term capital gain. Third possibility is short-term capital loss. So three possibilities broadly we can say. Of course, short-term capital gain or loss themselves can arise under different circumstances. Short-term capital loss can only arise when the entire block of assets is sold. Otherwise, short-term capital loss is not possible. Short-term capital gain can happen whether the entire block is sold or even part of the block is sold when full value of consideration is exceeding the COA and COI. So these are the aspects which we already know under the head of income PGBP. The same thing is mentioned under section 50 also in relation to capital gains computation of depreciable assets. Then section 50A is about electricity companies, that also we discussed in PGBP where electricity companies had a chance of taking straight line method of depreciation also. Such option is available to them. In that case, when the sale proceeds of the depreciable assets related to electricity company are exceeding the original cost at which they were acquired, then only there is a short-term capital gain. If not, there is a possibility of short-term capital loss. Because in case of electricity companies, the possibility is they can provide depreciation also and compute short-term gain or loss also on an asset by asset basis rather than block of assets basis. That is why 50A says in case of electricity companies, the COA will be nothing but the actual cost, which is originally the actual cost of acquisition at which those assets were acquired. So that is 50 depreciable assets of normal companies, 50A depreciable assets of electricity companies, how the treatment should be. Let us quickly go through this exercise number 6. Singhania and Co., a sole proprietorship, owns 6 machines put in use for business in March 2019, not our previous year. That was previous year 18-19. The depreciation on these machines is charged at the rate of 15%. Retained on value of these machines as on 1st April 2019 was 8,50,000. So that is the opening WDV of these machines or block of assets, we can say, that is 8,50,000. This is opening WDV. 3 of the old machines were sold on 10th June 2019 for 11 lakhs. We don't care about the date of sale at all, doesn't matter, as long as it is during the previous year. And a second hand plant was bought for 8,50,000 on 30th November 2019. So whether it is second hand or first hand, normal depreciation though there is no difference. If at all there is difference, that would be for additional depreciation. We don't need to worry about it. Basically, what is the claim that depreciation this Singhania and Co., which is a sole proprietorship firm, can claim during the assessment year 2020-21? What is the depreciation claim is the question. Of course, we are looking at machines and all. If you assume that this is a manufacturing organization, then additional depreciation is also possible. But before that, we should first of all know whether normal depreciation itself is possible or not. For that, naturally, we have to look at the details of what is the opening block of WDV, that is 8,50,000. Then assets acquired during the period, of course, put to use for less than 180 days. So that is another 8,50,000. Then assets sold, sale proceeds of the assets related to the same block during the year, 11 lakhs. So let us say sale proceeds. So what is the closing WDV or depreciable amount? 1617 minus 11 means 6 lakhs. So will there be any capital gains or losses in this case? So what is the answer for second question? Nothing. No capital gains that will be there in this particular case. Why? Because there is closing WDV and all assets are not sold. So no possibility of any capital gains implication. There is a depreciable amount which is there at the end of the year. Now the question number 1 was about computation of that depreciation. We can compute that 6 lakhs rupees into, because this 6 lakhs is less than 8,50,000, that is assets purchased and put to use for less than 180 days, this will be eligible for only half of the depreciation, which means 7.5% only will be eligible instead of 15%. Normal rate is 15%, only 7.5% will be the eligible depreciation. So 6 lakhs into 7.5% will be 45,000 is the normal depreciation. If at all we want to find out additional depreciation for the new asset that is purchased, we have to look at the other details. The question was telling that it is a second hand plant. When it is a second hand plant, it is not eligible for additional depreciation at all. So even though we assume that it is a manufacturing organization because the word used is machines, there is no possibility of additional depreciation. So finally, what is the total claim of depreciation that this sole proprietor firm can claim is rupees 45,000. That is the answer for first question. Answer for second question is nil, because there is no capital gain arising from this particular details. Then the question number 3 is about another variation in the data. If Singhania and Co had sold all the three machines in June 2019 for 21 lakhs, will there be any difference in your above workings? Definitely there will be a difference. Then instead of calculating like this, we have to reverse the presentation, because the sale proceeds are more than the cost of acquisition and cost of improvement. What is cost of acquisition and cost of improvement in case of depreciable asset? Opening WDV plus assets acquired during the year. That means 850 plus 850, that means 17 lakhs is the COA. When full value of consideration is more than that, definitely there will be a short term capital gain. How much is the full value of consideration? 21 lakhs. Then no expenses and all. If there were expenses related to transfer, we would have deducted. Then we would have got net consideration. When it is not there, it's okay, no problem. Then what is cost of acquisition or cost of improvement in case of depreciable assets? Nothing but opening WDV plus assets acquired during the period, which is equal to 17 lakhs. 850 plus 850. That's all. There is no depreciation possible here. There is only a short-term capital gain. In this scenario, we have to always mention it is short term or long term. If you just write capital gains, that will not be getting full marks. Whenever we say capital gains, we have to mention whether that is a short term capital gain or a long term capital gain when the data is available. Of course, for depreciable assets, always it will be a short term capital gain or short term capital loss. There is no way that it can be a long term capital gain or long term capital loss. That is the point to be noted. And of course, from the data given in the third point, the short term capital gain arises to be 4 lakhs rupees. That's it. That is exercise number 6, application of section 50. Now moving on to 50A is also there, that is electricity companies. We already solved those questions in PGBP itself. Then let's move on to 50B. Very important exclusive section related to capital gains, particularly computation of this capital gain in case of slump sale. So slump sale is a very important aspect by itself. Slump sale is nothing but lump sum sale. So normally whenever there is a sale of some assets that is happening, we know what is the full value of consideration of that asset, and at the same time we also know what was the cost of acquisition of that asset, and we'll have a deduction of these two things. Then we come to know what is capital gain or capital loss. But what if there is a batch of assets which is sold without knowing that how much is the sale value or full value of consideration for each of the assets? That situation is called as a slump sale. So first let us look at the definition. You don't need to remember the section. Understand the meaning. Name itself indicates slump is nothing but lump sum sale. Slump sale means the transfer of one or more undertakings, not just an asset. A particular organization, let us say, has 48 branches, where it is selling, let us say, 2 branches. That is a slump sale. One or more undertakings related to that organization. Majorly, what is the reason here? What is the main point here is for a lump sum consideration. Lump sum consideration is fixed for selling or transferring one or more undertakings of an organization. without determining the values of the individual assets and liabilities. So we don't know in this case how much is the value of each asset and each liability. That is not at all determined. Rather, an undertaking itself has been transferred for a lump sum consideration. In that case, we call the transaction as a slump sale first of all. Then, how to treat the profits or losses from the slump sale? They will be long term if the undertaking is owned by the SSE for more than 36 months. Otherwise, they will be short term, gain or loss. When you say gain, there is a possibility of loss also, that's fine. But the point is, whether the gains or losses from slump sale are long term or short term, how do we determine? We determine on the basis of whether the undertaking is owned by the SSE for more than 36 months or not. Individual assets may or may not be owned for 36 months, all of them, not necessary. When the undertaking itself is owned by the SSE for more than 36 months, then gains arising from such slump sale of that undertaking will be called as long-term capital gain. If not, it will be short-term capital gain. So that is a point to be noted. So slump sale means sale of an undertaking for a lump sum consideration without being able to ascertain what is the consideration for individual assets. That is what is slump sale. It is not amalgamation and such things. It is lesser than that. It is not the entire organization that is being sold here. It is only a part of the organization. That is also not demerger because it is not just getting hived off from its original shape. It is really some portion of the organization is sold to a third party. There is a consideration here for sure. So this cannot be called as demerger because in case of demerger, there is no consideration for the demerged company that it receives from resulting company. So that is only an internal kind of restructuring, but of course it creates a new legal entity, but still it is not a slump sale. And slump sale is not amalgamation also because the organization itself is not being sold completely. Only one or more of the undertakings of the organization are being sold for a lump sum consideration. There we were not able to determine what is the value of individual assets or liabilities. Then such transaction is called as slump sale. Then what is the speciality of this? The speciality here is because we don't know the cost of acquisition and cost of improvement, we cannot identify each of the assets separately. Because we don't know the full value of consideration separately, we cannot take the cost of acquisition, cost of improvement for each of the assets also separately. That is why what will be the cost of acquisition and cost of improvement for the purpose of slump sale, directly that will be the net worth of the undertaking that is transferred. So that is the point. So in the special cases of 50 depreciable assets, COA and COI was opening WDV plus assets purchased during the year. That is the special case of COA and COI under section 50. 50A is not special because the actual cost is actual cost. 50B once again is special because COA and COI here is net worth of the undertaking that is transferred. So there is no separate calculation of COA and COI for individual assets. For the entire undertaking, whatever is transferred now under slump sale transaction, the net worth of that undertaking has to be calculated. The natural question comes, what is net worth? Net worth is nothing but assets minus liabilities, normally always the same. What is the net worth of the undertaking? That is aggregate value of the total assets as reduced by the value of liabilities as appearing in the books of accounts. That is net worth. Total of assets minus outside liabilities. That's what is net worth. But again, the point here is when you take the aggregate value of the total assets, how to take the value of those assets depends upon what is the nature of the asset. In case of depreciable assets, WDV has to be taken. In case of the capital assets, for whom the entire expenditure was already allowed as deduction under 35 AD, nil should be taken here. This is an important point. Why? Logically same, because already full deduction was already claimed earlier. Now again, if you include it, that will be added to the cost of acquisition. That is again going to be claimed as deduction for the purpose of capital gains. That would be wrong. That is why if any asset was appearing in the balance sheet against which full expenditure was already claimed as deduction earlier under 35 AD, the value of that asset for the purpose of computing the net worth shall be taken as nil. In case of other assets, you have to take book value. So nothing special here. Normally whatever is there on the balance sheet, that will be only taken. In case of depreciable assets also, what will be there in the balance sheet? WDV only will be taken. Normally that will be the book value. However, point once again to notice, when you say WDV, is it the book value or WDV as per Income Tax Act? That is the point. It should be WDV as per Income Tax Act, not which is there appearing in the balance sheet of the undertaking. That is why it is given separately. Normally speaking, WDV itself will be book value, accounting purposes wise. But here, for purpose of depreciable assets, which are there appearing on the asset side of the balance sheet of the undertaking that is being transferred on slump sale, there is a possibility that depreciable assets are there on the balance sheet at accounting values. Then they will not be taken at that levels. We have to calculate the value of depreciable assets using Income Tax Act WDV. Other assets, if at all there are any, they can be taken at book value. Assets for whom already a full deduction has been already claimed under Income Tax Act, for them the value shall be taken as nil. That is how the total assets will be taken. From those total assets, deduct the liabilities, what you get is net worth. Deduct that net worth from the full value of consideration, which is the lump sum consideration, you get capital gain or loss from the slump sale, which will be long term if the undertaking was held for more than 36 months. If not, it will be a short term capital gain. Of course, there are some important other points also to be noted here, very important points. Of course, not the CA report and all, that will be anyway one of the compliance requirements in the entire Income Tax Act, wherein chartered accountants will have to certify certain things. This is one of them. That's a practical administrative thing, which the clients will definitely get these certificates from the chartered accountants. That certification of net worth has to be attached to the return of income to make sure that the computation of net worth has been done correctly and appropriately. That is one practical thing that we don't have to worry about that. But main thing what we have to look at is no benefit of indexation is allowed in case of slump sale. That is very important for us. Why and all again we cannot ask. The law says so. Sir, what if the undertaking is held for more than 36 months and the gains arising from the slump sale are long-term capital gains? Even then there is no indexation? Yes, even then there is no indexation. No indexation shall be allowed in case of slump sale for the cost of acquisition or cost of development. No means no. Here, because the topic has come, we have to address a very important point where some of the times students will mess it up. Indexation is a benefit which is given to long-term capital assets. That does not mean just because indexation is not there, the assets are not long-term capital assets. That is a misinterpretation people take. Indexation is not the proof whether a particular asset is a long-term capital asset or short-term capital asset, whether the gain or loss arising is a long-term capital gain or short-term capital gain. No, that is not the proof. Long-term capital asset, short-term capital asset depends upon period of holding. That is the proof for the categorization of assets, whether that asset is a long-term capital asset or short-term capital asset. However, indexation is one thing which is also available, which is available only for long-term capital assets. So to once again repeat it in one sentence, indexation is there means asset is a long-term capital asset for sure. However, vice versa is not true. If there is no indexation, that does not mean that asset is not a long-term capital asset. It could be still a long-term capital asset, but still there could be a possibility of no indexation. Like for example, bonds or debentures. That was already there as an example. Those might be long-term capital assets. The gain or loss arising from the sale of bonds or debentures may be long-term capital gain, no problem. But still there is no benefit of indexation. Law said no benefit of indexation for them. Same way law is telling now, for slump sale there is no benefit of indexation. That means no benefit of indexation. That does not mean the gain or loss here is not long-term capital gain or loss. So that is a very important point to note. we have to understand the law in a straight manner. We should not imagine the reverse also to be true, not necessarily. That is why there is still a possibility of a long-term capital gain from the sale of assets in a lump sum basis, which is slump sale, if the undertaking itself was owned by the SEC for more than 36 months. Okay, but still there is no benefit of indexation even if it is a long-term capital gain. That is a very important, crucial point to be noted under section 50B. And another important point while solving the problems we should note is revaluation of the assets shall be ignored. If the assets are revalued earlier before slump sale, assets value would be higher naturally. And while calculating the net worth, should we include those revalued amounts? No, answer is no. We should ignore the revaluation, whatever happened already in the books of accounts earlier prior to slump sale. So revaluation should not be considered while calculating the aggregate value of total assets. That means while calculating net worth. So revaluation shall be ignored. That is another important point to be noted. In relation to 50B, so that is 50B, slump sale. Now let us look at exercise number 7, which is a past examination question also, which was given earlier for 5 marks. Exercise number 7. Mr. A is a proprietor of Akash Enterprises having 2 units. He transferred on 1/4/2019 his unit 1 by way of slump sale for a total consideration of 25 lakhs. Total consideration means a lump sum consideration. Which one he transferred, that you should identify. He has 2 units, but he transferred only 1 unit, that is unit 1. Expenses incurred in this transfer were 28,000. Balance sheet as on 31st March 2019, that is just before the transfer of unit 1, is given as under. Balance sheets of both the units are given. Asset side it is given separately for unit 1 and unit 2. Liability side total is given. Of course we have to bifurcate whatever is related to unit 1 only. We are not bothered about unit 2 at all. Only unit 1 is transferred, that is the only thing which is slump sale. But look at other information. Revaluation reserve is created by revising upward the value of the building of unit 1. Okay, if you look at the liability side, there is a revaluation reserve 3 lakhs rupees for the building of unit 1. So building amount of unit 1 which is there on the asset side, 12 lakhs rupees, naturally includes this revaluation also. Should we take that? Answer is no. In other words, how much we should take for the value of the building while calculating the net worth? We should take only 9 lakhs but not 12 lakhs because already building was revalued upwards by 3 lakhs, because of which earlier possibly an entry would have been passed, building account at R2, revaluation reserve account 3 lakhs, because of which the building is overvalued now by 3 lakhs. Accounting wise all of that is okay, they can do that. But now while calculating the net worth for the purpose of section 50B, we cannot include that revaluation profit which is already included in the building value. So building's value has to be taken as 9 lakhs instead of 12 lakhs. That's what we can infer from first point. Second, no individual value of any asset is considered in the transfer deed. That is why we are calling it as lump sale. And third point says, other assets of unit 1 include patents acquired on 1/7/2017 for 50,000 rupees on which no depreciation has been charged. So they did not charge depreciation on not the entire things. Other assets include 50,000 rupees patents which were acquired in year 2017-18, but they did not charge any depreciation. Is that okay? No, it is not okay. We have to calculate the WDV of the assets if it is a depreciable assets. Patents is a depreciable asset. Definitely intangible assets are depreciable assets. They are chargeable to, they are eligible for depreciation under section 32, which for intangible assets is 25%. They did not do all this. So what we should do? We should do that. We should find out what is the WDV of those patents and include that as part of one of the assets of unit 1. As far as liabilities are concerned, it was clear. Out of 2 lakhs, 70% is for unit 1, and out of 1,50,000 creditors, 25% is for unit 1. These are the outside liabilities. Capital is not a liability. Capital is capital. It is on the liabilities side. So outside liabilities are only these. Revaluation reserve is gone anyway because that has nothing to do with our calculation. So reserves and surpluses and shareholders funds or capital, those are not which will be important or which will be identified at all for computation purposes. Simply speaking, net worth is nothing but the assets minus of liabilities which are outside liabilities. For this purpose, we should find out net worth also. Then only we can find out what is the capital gain or loss arising from this slump sale done by Mr. A. So let us do this as a solution. Exercise number 7. So first of all, normal calculation, full value of consideration. So what is full value of consideration? So full value of consideration is 25 lakhs, that is given. Deduct expenses in connection with the transfer. You have to write the full forms obviously in the exam. Expenses in connection with transfer, how much? 28,000. So naturally, if you deduct that from full value of consideration, what we get is net sale consideration. That will be how much? 24 lakhs 72,000. That is there already. From this, what we are supposed to deduct? Cost of acquisition or cost of improvement. But for slump sale, what is cost of acquisition and cost of improvement in accordance with section 50B? That is nothing but net worth of the undertaking that is transferred. So for that purpose, we should find out net worth. So working notes. Computation of net worth. So net worth will have to be calculated naturally by taking assets and liabilities. So what are the assets, what are the liabilities? Of unit 1 we should take one by one. First thing first, building. Building was how much? 12 lakhs, but we should not take 12 lakhs. We should take only 9 lakhs. That was building. Then machinery, we can take whatever is there because no other information is given. 3 lakhs book value. That itself should be written on value because there is no problem in that. Other assets like debtors should be taken at book value, that is 1 lakh. And other assets 1,50,000 included something, patents, which we should calculate separately. And other than patents, there are other assets of 1 lakh. That 1 lakh has no problem. Let it be there. But patents has a problem. What is the problem? They did not provide depreciation on these patents for the years since it has been acquired. So that we should do. So 50,000 rupees originally the patents were acquired for. Patents depreciation is 25%, for which year you have to be carefully calculating for each year when these are used. So 17, 18, 25% of 50,000 means 12,500. So remaining will be 37,500. From that, again 37,500. 17, 18 is this. 18, 19 also depreciation should be provided, right? So on 37,500, 25% means 9,375. If you deduct that also, what is the remaining amount? 28,125. So that is going to be the WDV of patents, which should be taken here, 28,125. Since they did not provide depreciation, we have to calculate and find out the correct WDV for this particular asset, which is a depreciable asset, 28,125. That's it. These are the assets which are all there on the asset side of the balance sheet. And on the liability side, what all the things we have to take? You can just have a subtotal of assets, just for presentation purposes. 9 lakhs plus 3 lakhs plus 1 lakh plus 1 lakh plus 28,125. So 14 lakhs 28,125. Will be the total of assets. But that is not net worth. From that we have to deduct liabilities also. What are the liabilities? One is bank loan, second one is trade creditors. How much is that? Bank loan 70% is for unit 1. So 70% of 2 lakhs is 1,40,000. That should be reduced. Then creditors is 25% for unit 1. So 1,50,000, 25% means 37,500. That also should be reduced. so that what we get is called as net worth. So how much is that? Calculate it. 14,28,125 minus 1,40,000 minus 37,500, that comes to 12,50,625. That's it. That is net worth. So what is the purpose of all this net worth? That will be considered to be the cost of acquisition and cost of improvement, because this transaction is a slump sale. So 1250,625 is the cost of acquisition and cost of improvement. So 12,50,625. Once you substitute it, then you get how much is the capital gain or loss. So 24,72,000 minus 1250,625, that will give you 12,21,375 rupees capital gain. So naturally the question comes whether it is a short-term capital gain or a long-term capital gain. We don't know how many months this unit has been held by Mr. A. It was not given. But one thing can be definitely easily understood from one of the information that is there. Patents were acquired on 1/7/2017 means. So 17 to 18, 18 to 19, 19. So almost definitely prior to 2017 itself, this unit must be existing. But still we cannot conclusively tell that it is held for more than 36 months. We can write an assumption. Assuming that unit 1 has been held by Akash Enterprises for more than 36 months, these capital gains are treated to be long-term capital gains. 12,21,375 can be taken as long-term capital gains, assuming unit 1 is held by Akash Enterprises for more than 36 months. Since the information is not there, there is nothing wrong in assuming that, and concluding something which is whether it is short-term or long-term. That is how we should calculate the capital gains in case of slump sale. We should find out net worth, and that net worth should be treated as if it is the cost of acquisition and cost of improvement. That should be deducted from the net sale consideration. We get capital gains. That's all. While computing net worth, revaluation reserves, revaluation of the fixed assets should be ignored, and for the depreciable assets, written down value should be taken. For other assets, book value should be taken. Of course, in the exam questions, there may be some kind of asset which might be told that against this asset already deduction has been claimed under section 35 AD fully. Then value of such assets for this purpose shall be taken as nil. Like this, you take all the total of assets, deduct the outside liabilities related to this undertaking. We get net worth of that undertaking. That itself will be the cost of acquisition or cost of improvement for such undertaking in a transaction of slump sale. That is about section 50B. So we discussed about section 50, 50A and 50B. Now let us move on to section 50C. This is also one thing that I already told you in PGBP. 43CA in relation to real estate transactions, how to compute full value of consideration if that real estate asset, land or building or both, was a stock in trade of the SSE, how to compute it under section 43CA. We discussed it in the chapter of PGBP. I told you the same logic will be applied in section 50C of capital gains also then. Now we are going to apply that for this chapter of capital gains under section 50C. So what is this speciality of 50C is where there is a transfer of immovable property. Immovable property means it could be land or building or both. And if the value determined by the stamp valuation authority, usually stamp valuation authority will be state government, whatever the stamp valuation has been fixed for that property, that can be called as stamp duty valuation, and the value fixed by stamp valuation authority, SVA we can call it for reference purposes. Why that is calculated? For the purpose of payment of stamp duty. That stamp valuation authority or the stamp duty valuation, if it is more than the sale consideration declared by the SSE, then whatever the value that is assessed by the stamp valuation authority shall be treated as if it is the full value of consideration for the purpose of capital gains. Is there any difference here from 43CA to 50C? No difference. Only point is, there in 43CA, the stamp valuation, whatever is higher than the actual consideration, that is treated as full value of consideration, but that was taxable under the head of PGBP as a normal business revenue, since land or buildings in that case was the stock in trade of the SSE. But here land or buildings which are immovable properties are not stock in trade of the SSE. That is why we are talking about they being capital assets. We have to understand always the definition of capital assets. We have to keep that in mind. Capital assets definition excludes stock in trade. So when we are saying we are talking about capital gains itself means it is not stock in trade. It is a capital asset held by the SSE. Now he is selling it. While he is selling it, stamp duty value of that asset is more than the value that he actually sold for, or at least he is claiming to sell for. Then Income Tax Act says that we don't believe the value given by the SSE, but we believe the stamp duty valuation as if it is the full value of consideration. Don't write all these things, believing and all. That is for understanding purposes. Provision is what you have to write. What is the provision? Where there is a transfer of immovable property and the stamp duty valuation of such property is more than the sale consideration, then according to section 50C, the stamp duty valuation shall be treated as full value of consideration. That's it. However, we have already known this also. In case the stamp duty value is not more than 105% of the sale consideration, then 50C is not applicable. In other words, the difference between stamp duty valuation and the actual consideration should be at least more than 5%. At least. So then only 50C will apply. If there is a nominal small difference between stamp duty value and sale consideration, we can ignore that. What is small? We are not the ones to decide what is small. The law already decided. 5% difference is small. 5% of what? Sale consideration. So the difference between stamp duty valuation and sale consideration, we have to first take it and keep it aside. If that is more than 5% of the sale consideration, then only 50C will be applicable. If it is 5% of sale consideration also, it is applicable. If it is not more than 5% of sale consideration, then 50C is not applicable. So that is a point to be rated in relation to 50C. But another important point is also there, particularly when there is a difference in the date of agreement and date of registration, or when the actual property has been sold. Agreement might have happened long back. Actual registration and actual stamp duty payment and all the other formalities are happening now. In between, the stamp duty might have changed, the valuation might have changed. Then, which date's stamp duty valuation should be considered? Should we take the date of agreement's stamp duty valuation or date of registration stamp duty valuation? Normally, in a general case, where we cannot say that always it will happen, generally what happens? From the date of agreement, which was a past date, and the date of registration, which is a recent date, the stamp duty value might have increased. There was never a situation where the state governments have decreased the stamp duty valuation. That could be probably eighth wonder if it happens. So normally stamp duty values increase. SC would have agreed into selling this property 3 months back. Then the stamp duty value would have been lower. Now the stamp duty value would have increased in these 3 months because state government has revised them. So which stamp duty value has to be taken for the purpose of Income Tax Act? Should we take the stamp duty valuation on the date of agreement, or should we take the stamp duty valuation on the date of registration? Answer is we can take the stamp duty valuation on the date of agreement only provided the consideration is paid by any mode other than cash. That is the condition litigation that 50C has kept. Why is that? Otherwise, what people will do if this is not there? They will tell, oh, date of agreement was 20 years back. Since then, we could not actually execute that agreement. Now the time has come, we have registered. 20 years back stamp duty I will take, they will tell. That will not be possible. That should not be allowed, right? So that is why you cannot just tell that, oh, the agreement happened. Agreement happened, what is the proof? The proof is literally payment, at least some advance payment, not necessarily the full payment. So if it is paid in cash, if the SEC says, we don't believe that. So only point is, if agreement has been made at an earlier date and at least part of the consideration has been received by modes other than cash on the date of agreement, then only the stamp duty valuation on the date of agreement can be taken for the purpose of 50C. Otherwise, stamp duty valuation on the date of registration, which is the conclusive evidence of the sale, shall only be considered. Other than that, if SEC claims that agreement already happened, that claim has to be substantiated by a transfer or payment by the buyer to the SEC by modes other than cash. That's it. That is what 50C is all about. Very important section. Definitely one of the most important sections in the entire chapter of capital gains. Why? Because in the capital gains chapter, at a broader level, if you look at, there might be any type of capital assets which can be sold by our SSE, who will be our problem, who will be the subject matter of our problem. But in general, broadly there are two categories which will be more frequent. One is financial instruments, mostly like shares and all. We'll come to that later. Second thing is immovable property. What else capital assets people will sell normally? What capital assets people will sell? Normally also, if you think, what capital assets people will have? Nothing much. They'll have either land or building, some plot of land or some building they have, some house they have, that they can sell. Or they may sell the shares which they hold, some financial instruments. Of course, they may sell gold or something else, ornaments or something else. That is also quite possible. But again, that is a other type of assets which are rare. In general, broad category of assets that can be sold are two. One is immovable property, two is shares. Third category will not be there. Yes, it will be there. Any number of, any types of capital assets can be sold. But what I meant to say is in general. So, almost when we say 50C, is covering 50% of the chapter. Automatically, whenever there is a problem that we encounter in capital gains chapter, there will be a possibility of, half possibility of that asset that is being transferred as a immovable property. So automatically when the asset is immovable property, 50C can be easily introduced in the question, and it will be introduced in the question. Once the property sold by the SSE is an immovable property, the capital asset that is sold by the SSE is immovable property, there is no doubt that every question of that will have some reference to 50C application. That is why it is very, very important section in the entire chapter of capital gains, particularly from examination point of view, problems which can be expected from this chapter point of view. So what is 50C? In a nutshell, in case the transfer of immovable property happens, the full value of consideration for the purpose of capital gains shall be higher of 1. Sale consideration declared by the SSE, or value determined by the stamp valuation authority for the purpose of stamp duty, whichever is higher will be taken as full value of consideration. That's it. That can be easily understood as the essence of 50C. Of course, only when stamp valuation will be relevant if it is more than 105% of sale consideration, or we can say if it is more than sale consideration by 5% or more. So then only. So then stamp valuation will be compared with the sale consideration, whichever is higher will be taken as full value of consideration. This is what 50C also says and 43CA also says. Nothing new from there to here. But now there is something that is new, which is in addition to what we already know. What is that is? Logically, if you see, there might be a possibility that stamp valuations are unrealistically high sometimes, and SSE might have sold the property for lesser amount, but stamp valuations are too high, because of which he has to pay capital gains tax on such a full value of consideration which he never received. That is unfair, right? If it is the case, if genuinely SSE has sold it for a lesser sale consideration, because the market value is like that, but stamp valuations are so unnaturally high. State governments are not always reflecting the exact market values in relation to the stamp valuations. Just for example, just to take as an example, say in Hyderabad, near the airport, Shamshabad airport, at one point in time the stamp valuations were so high because lot of real estate transactions happened. The stamp valuations were increased by the state government drastically during those periods when the airport was getting developed, and after that lot of number of months when the activities were there higher. But later the values of land near the airport have reduced. But state government will not reduce the stamp valuation. It will keep the same. So let us say if the square yard as per stamp valuation is 5,000, real market value if it is 3,000, as an example, I really don't know what is the value and all. I'm just giving an example. Real market value is only 3,000 per square yard, but stamp valuation is 5,000, which is unrealistically high. But actually the SSE has genuinely sold this property at a lower value. But in spite of that, because of section 50C application, his full value of consideration will be taken at a higher amount, which is the stamp duty valuation, which is definitely unfair. So should there be any opportunity given to the SSE so that this unfairness can be corrected? Yes. That is what is given here. However, when the SSE claims before assessing officer that the value assessed by the stamp valuation authority is higher than the fair market value of such immovable property, and also the value assessed by the stamp valuation authority has not been disputed in any appeal before any authority or court. That means there is no dispute on this already somewhere. If it is already there, then that will be difficult. Why? Because whatever the court says, that has to be taken as final later. But if there is no other dispute against this valuation, we are not talking about dispute of property. If there is no dispute or any litigation about the valuation of this property, but SSE says that the valuation which is given by stamp valuation authority is higher than the real actual fair market value that is related to the immovable property, he has a genuine case, let us say. Then what he can do? Then SC can request the assessing officer to not apply 50C directly, but assessing officer can refer this valuation of capital assets to a valuation officer. So assessing officer will not directly apply 50C. He will wait for some time and also says, no problem, if the SC is so feeling that the fair market value of this asset is much lesser than stamp duty valuation and stamp duty valuation is unrealistically high, if that is the contention of the SSE, SC has definitely a right to ask the assessing officer, boss, this is unfair, do something for this. So what the assessing officer will do? He will refer this valuation to a valuation officer, a professional who is going to be valuing this particular property. Then, once the valuation officer submits the report, sale consideration final, this is final, shall be lower of the following, very important. Earlier, we took higher of the two things. Higher of what? Actual sale consideration declared by the SSE or stamp duty valuation, whichever was higher. This 105% is always there as a condition, let us forget about it. That will be there. We have to check that. If it is satisfied, we just have to ignore that. That has nothing to do with other calculations. It is only to check whether 50C is applicable or not. Yes, leave it, enough. After that, that 105% has no relevance. So how to apply 50C, that is important. What is that? We have to take the full value of consideration as if, which is the higher of these two. Actual consideration or stamp duty valuation, whichever is higher. But if the SSE went for appeal or asked the assessing officer to refer it to the valuation officer and valuation officer submitted the report, then what should be taken as final amount of full value of consideration is value determined by the valuation officer or the value determined by the stamp valuation authority for the purpose of stamp duty, whichever is lower. So what we should understand here? Imagine, just for understanding purposes, in our example, fair market value of one particular land per square yard was 3,000. Right? That's what the example we have taken. And 5,000 is the stamp duty valuation. SC said, boss, this is unfair. Refer it to valuation officer. Valuation officer came after his thorough valuation and all. He said, boss, actually the market value is not even 5,000, it is 6,000. That is more dangerous to the SC. It is like this. In case a student applies for revaluation, if he gets lower marks than the original answer, original valuation, then what? Okay. What will be taken depends upon the decision of the exam conducting body. But what is fair, at least? Should we reduce the marks of the student because in the revaluation he got lesser marks than the original valuation? That will be not fair also. At least we have to keep the original marks that he got. Isn't it? Same way here also. On one side, the SC said stamp valuation is very high. But valuation officer came with the report saying that stamp valuation is not high, it is actually low. Market value really is much higher than that. Then we will not take that valuation officer's report. We will take stamp duty valuation only. In other words, if valuation officer gives a report saying that market value is less than stamp duty valuation, we adopt that report. If the stamp duty valuation or if the valuation officer says that market value is still more than the stamp duty valuation, we just ignore that report. Simply speaking, essence of all this is this. The value determined by the valuation officer cannot be more than the valuation by stamp valuation authority. If it is more, we throw it in the dustbin. If it is more, it cannot be more than valuation by stamp valuation authority, but at the same time it cannot be less than sale consideration also. If the valuation officer comes down and says that, in our example, market value is only 2500 per square yard, should we take 2500? No, because SC already said he sold it for 3000. How can the valuation be less than actual consideration? No way. So valuation officer's report and the valuation referred by valuation officer cannot be more than stamp duty valuation. It cannot be less than sale consideration. So point is, when should we consider at all the report submitted by valuation officer? When is it relevant? Only when that valuation is more than actual consideration but less than stamp valuation. Then valuation officer's final valuation will be taken as full value of consideration. Otherwise, it will be just ignored. If the valuation is less than actual consideration also, it will be ignored. If that valuation is more than stamp duty valuation also, it will be ignored. If it is somewhere in between actual sale consideration and stamp valuation, then such valuation done by valuation officer shall be taken as full value of consideration or sale consideration. That is the essence of section 50C. Once again, very, very important point. Always actual consideration should be compared with the stamp duty valuation, whichever is higher should be taken. That should be compared with valuation officer's point, and whichever is lower should be taken, of course, not in case the valuation officer's report is saying a valuation of less than actual consideration. That is not possible. So that is about 50C, immobile properties and real estate transactions, application of capital gains, computation of capital gains, computation of full value of consideration under 50C. Let us apply this for understanding purposes. Take this illustration. Find the sale consideration for the purpose of computation of capital gain on the sale of land in the following cases. Look at these things. Each of them is a separate case. Actual sale consideration is given, all rupees in lakhs. Stamp duty valuation is given. Value decided by valuation officer is given. So let us take one by one. Case number 1. Actual sale consideration is 50. Stamp duty valuation is 60. Is it more than actual sale consideration by 5%? Definitely yes. So forget about that 5%. So definitely we have to take stamp duty valuation as full value of consideration. Then that is referred to the valuation officer. He came with 70. We should ignore that because it is more than stamp duty valuation. So finally, what will be the full value of consideration taxable? That is 60. This is going to be the value that will be taken as full value of consideration. That is first case. Second case. Actual sale consideration 80, stamp duty valuation 50. Of course, when the SC himself says actual consideration is more than stamp duty valuation, happily we will say, okay, no problem. That is fine. So what will be the taxable amount of full value of consideration? Naturally, 80. So in that case, 80 will be the full value of consideration. In the first case, 60 will be the full value of consideration. Third case, actual sale consideration 60, stamp valuation is 80, there is no valuation. So when there is no valuation, we have to take whatever is higher. Stamp duty valuation is higher, that to more than by 5%. So 80 is the answer for third scenario. Fourth scenario, actual sale consideration 80, stamp valuation 90, value decided by valuation officer is 60. So when value decided by the valuation officer is less than actual sale consideration, that cannot be taken at all. So first thing first, understand the steps carefully. First we will take actual consideration and stamp duty valuation, whichever is higher. So which is higher? Stamp duty valuation is higher. Value decided by the valuation officer is less than stamp duty valuation, that is okay. So 60 has to be taken, but it cannot be less than actual consideration itself. So what has to be taken as full value of consideration here? 80 should be taken as full value of consideration. Since the valuation officer's report is telling that the value is less than stamp duty value, whichever is lower has to be taken, which is 60. But since it is lower than actual sale consideration, it will not be final. Actual consideration itself will be taken as real full value of consideration in that case. Then last case, 80 lakhs is the actual consideration, stamp valuation is 90, so whichever is higher, 90. 90 is compared with 100, whichever is lower, so 90 only will remain. So that is the application of section 50C for immovable properties transactions. Let us understand and do some of the questions or problems here. Such type of questions can be asked also, small questions, and they are useful for practice also before we go to the bigger questions later. There is nothing like big or small, depending upon the type of question given in the exam, we have to solve it. Mr. A, who transfers the land and building on 2nd January 2020, that is during our previous year, furnishes the following information. So of course we have to calculate what ultimately is the capital gains. So let us compute the capital gains by taking full value of consideration or net consideration itself. So net sale consideration is given directly in the question. So when it is already given directly, take that net sale consideration received is 10 lakhs. Okay. Then what? This is taken. Value adopted by the Stamp Valuation Authority, which was not contested by A, is 15 lakhs. So when net sale consideration is 10 lakhs, value adopted by Stamp Valuation Authority is 15 lakhs. What should be taken? Should we take 10 lakhs or 15 lakhs? We should take whichever is higher. That means 15 lakhs. That itself will be taken as full value of consideration. Of course, since there is no expenses, that itself is net consideration also. And value ascertained by the valuation officer on reference by the assessing officer is also 15 lakhs. When both are same, there is no problem. 15 lakhs itself can be taken as final amount, which becomes taxable. SC actually would have received 10 lakhs. We don't care. For the purpose of computation of capital gains, because of 50C, we take 15 lakhs is a taxable amount, not 10 lakhs. Then we have to deduct naturally the cost of acquisition, indexed cost of acquisition or indexed cost of acquisition, improvement. This land was distributed to Mr. A on the partial partition of his HUF on 1/4/2001. However, he got it. He did not buy it, by the way. He just got it pukkat mein. Just like that, he got free from his own HUF, partial partition of his own HUF. He got it on 1/4/2001, and the fair market value on 1/4/2001 was 1,10,000 rupees. So, actually speaking, even if we take it prior to 1/4/2001 is better. So let us take this as 2,000. 1/4/2000 he got, let us say. Fair market value on 1/4/2001 is 1,10,000. So in other words, we don't know anything else, right? Because there is no cost of acquisition at all. What was the cost of acquisition to the previous owner, that is HUF, that also we don't know. Only fair market value is given. When that is the only thing there, why should we worry about it? Indexed cost of acquisition, just we have to calculate. How to calculate? Cost of acquisition in this case will be whatever the fair market value on 1/4/2001, 1,10,000 into, we need to remember the index numbers for the previous year, 289 divided by 100. Do the calculation. 1,10,000 into 289 by 100. That will be how much? 3,17,900. So the index numbers have to be there. 289 for the previous year, 100 for prior to 1/4/2001, anything is 100 only. Then indexed cost of improvement is also there in the form of a building being constructed on the same land at a cost of 3,20,000. Construction, when it was done, that you have to look at it. Construction completed on 1/12/2010. We'll come to that later, but first 3,20,000 is the cost of improvement. When this land and building is separately sold, we can do the calculation separately. If not, land is indexed cost of acquisition, building is nothing but improvement on that. So 3,20,000 into 289 common divided by year, you have to look at which year is this? 2010-11 financial year. Always you have to identify from the date and month. So 2010-11, what is the CII? 10-11, 167. Then you do the calculation. 3,20,000 into 289 divided by 167. That comes to around 5,53,772. That's all. When you have the indexed cost of acquisition and indexed cost of improvement, deduct it from the full value of consideration or net sale consideration. In this case, you get long term capital gain 553,772 317,900 has to be reduced from 15 lakhs. So the long-term capital gain here is 6,28,328. You have to clearly write in full form long-term capital gain. Okay, so that is about application of 50C also and computation of capital gains in case of normal real estate transactions also. Now, that is done. Go to exercise number 9. Mr. Thomas inherited a house in Jaipur under the will of his father in May 2010. So naturally, it is prior to 2010 it is, no, not 2000. So May 2010 means which year? Immediately I have to look at 2010-11. That is when he has acquired this property from his father as from a will. The house was purchased by his father in January 2001. That is before 1/4/2001 for 2,50,000. And he invested an amount of 7 lakhs rupees in construction of one more floor in June 2012. That means 2012-13. The house was sold by him in November 2019 during our previous year. That is 37 lakhs 50,000 is the sale value or full value of consideration. But valuation adopted by the registration authorities for the charge of stamp duty was 47 lakhs 25,000, which was not contested by the buyer. But as per SSC's request, assessing officer made a reference to valuation officer. Value determined by the valuation officer is 47 lakhs 50,000. Can it be higher than the stamp valuation? No. So this 47 lakhs 50,000 is not going to be considered at all. Whichever is lower of them will only be taken, which is 47 lakhs 25,000. That is full value of consideration. Brokerage of 1% of sale consideration was paid by Mr. Thomas to Sunil, whoever it is, we don't care. SSC is Mr. Thomas. The market value of the house on 1/4/2001 was 2,70,000. So that is the amount of market value when on 1/4/2001. You are required to compute the amount of capital gains chargeable to tax with the help of the given information. So many provisions are applicable here. A perfect question. This was given in the past exams also. So first of all, full value of consideration. The format of computation of capital gains is always the same. Starting with full value of consideration. How much has to be taken as full value of consideration? And application of which section we are doing this? These are all notes that can be written. We are applying 50C for computing full value of consideration. 47 lakhs 25,000 is what? Is full value of consideration, since it is the stamp duty valuation which is higher than actual consideration, and since valuation officer's report gave a value of more than stamp duty valuation, that will be ignored. So 47 lakhs 25,000 itself will be taken as full value of consideration. Deduct expenses in connection with transfer. Expenses in connection with transfer. This is where most of the times people do mistake, because 1% is there, blindly they calculate 1% of 47 lakhs 25,000. No, that is wrong. You have to read the question carefully. Brokerage of 1% of what? Sale consideration. 47 lakhs 25,000 is not sale consideration. That is stamp duty valuation. Actual sale consideration, reality is reality. Whether we believe it or not, law may not believe it. That's a different story. That is why we are applying the law under section 50C and took 47 lakhs 25,000 as full value of consideration. But brokerage will not be paid on that, no. Brokerage will be paid on actual sale consideration, which is 37 lakhs 50,000. So 37 lakhs 50,000 actual sale consideration. On that 1% means 37,500 is going to be expenses in connection with the transfer. That means the net sale consideration is how much? Once again, be careful. 47 lakhs 25,000 minus 37,500. 46 lakhs 87,500. That is net sale consideration. Don't think that expenses are related to full value of consideration. Just like municipal taxes to be calculated on municipal value, not on gross annual value. Same way, in income from house property, mistakes will be done if you are not conscious and cautious. Here also mistakes are possible, so be very cautious. 1% on not full value of consideration, 1% on sale consideration. In this case, because of application of 50C, both are not same. So we cannot apply 1% on 47 lakhs 25. We have to apply 1% on 37 lakh 50,000, which is 37,500. After deducting it from the full value of consideration, we get net sale consideration. Then we have to deduct indexed cost of acquisition. Of course, we have to apply provisions here. So many provisions. First of all, SSE did not acquire this asset. He did not purchase it. He got it by will. When he got it by will, then what is the provision related to? Section 49, which says cost of acquisition in case of gift, will or inheritance will have to be taken as what? Whatever the cost of acquisition of previous owner. His previous owner was who? Father. But he also did not purchase the asset after 1/4/2001. He purchased it before 1/4/2001 for 2,50,000. So another provision will apply for the assets purchased before 1/4/2001. We have to compare the actual cost of acquisition and fair market value on 1/4/2001, whichever is higher. So 2,50,000 or 2,70,000, whichever is higher. 2,70,000 is higher naturally. So 2,70,000 into 289 is okay. But once again another point comes about denominator. Denominator is what? CII of the year in which the asset was first held by the SSE. When the asset was first held by the SSE, Mr. Damas, in the year 2010-11. So should we take 2010-11 CII in the denominator? Because this is will. That is again a subject to interpretation. We have to refer to Manjula Shah versus CIT. So Manjula Shah case, what the court has said, in case of gift, we have to take the indexation of the year in which the previous owner has acquired the asset. Of course, that case was gift. So Manjula Shah case definitely told if it is a gift, we have to take the CII in the denominator related to the year in which the previous owner first acquired the asset. But for logical and practical purposes, is will is also not a kind of gift only, or inheritance also is not a kind of gift only. In all the cases, there is no consideration at all. So I am not saying that court has already included all the three. I am not saying that. But taking a liberal interpretation of what court has said, once court said it is something about gift, that too related to unrelated parties completely, then will and inheritance, though at least from the own father and own relatives, no, in general. So the provisions of Manjula Shah case can be extended to gift, will and inheritance also, is the interpretation that we are taking. No sir, I will not extend it, I will only apply for gift because court said only gift, I will not take for will and inheritance. It is your choice. But I am going to extend it to will also. It is as good as gift. There is no difference in essence between all of them. When you look at the essence of these transactions, when there is no consideration that is paid by the SSC to the previous owner, but just like that SC has got the assets from the previous owner, when one logic is applied to gift, there is no reason why we cannot apply that to will and inheritance using the same analogy of Manjula Shah case. That is why CA of the year in which the SSC first acquired 2010-11 we are not taking. Rather, we will take the CA of the year in which the asset was acquired by the previous owner, his father, which is prior to 1/4/2001. So we have to take 100 only naturally for that. So that is the indexed cost of acquisition. Calculate it and keep it separate. So 2,70,000 into 289 divided by 100. That will be 7,80,300. That is indexed cost of acquisition. But the story is not over. There is indexed cost of improvement also. Indexed cost of improvement is what? Once again, you have to look at the data that is given in the question. Indexed cost of improvement, how much? 7 lakhs rupees, construction of one more floor, that was spent in June 2012. So 7 lakhs rupees is the indexed cost of improvement. Into 289 is common. But when was that invested? When was that spent? June 2012 means 2012-13. 12-13, what is the index number? We have to look at that. 12-13 index number was 200. So when 12-13 index number is 200, that will be there in the denominator. 2012-13, because that happened in June 2012. That is 2012-13. Index number is 200. So you have to carefully take the index numbers from the table. 12, 13, 200. Correct. Then calculation. 7 lakhs into 289 by 200. That comes to 10 lakhs 11,500. That's it. Indexed cost of acquisition and indexed cost of improvement both are reduced from the net sale consideration, which is 46 lakhs 87,500. 46 lakhs 87,500 minus 780,300 minus 10 lakhs 11,500. So what is the long term capital gain? 28 lakhs 95,700. Naturally, long term capital gain 28 lakhs 95,700. That's it. That is a long term capital gain taxable in the hands of Thomas. He sold the asset, it will be taxable in his hands. Okay, he did not buy the asset, he got it by will, doesn't matter. In that case, we take the cost of acquisition of previous owner. But once again, since the previous owner, his father has acquired it before 1/4/2001, we took the fair market value on 1/4/2001 being higher than the original cost. Then we applied Manjula Shah case also for the indexation of that amount. Indexed cost of improvement is straightforward. Whenever that is done, that year's CII should be taken in denominator. Numerator is always the year of transfer, which naturally in most of the cases should be the previous year only. So, what is the final long-term capital gain? 28 lakhs 95,700. How perfect 5 marks question this is. So many points are applicable. And you can write all these points in notes also, which are given in the left side. 50C you have to write a note, 49(1) you have to write a note, Manjula Shah case you have to write, all these things you have to write as working notes. Calculations of course also have to be shown, then you get the final correct answer with accuracy and presentation. That gives full marks for such questions. That is application of 50C. Of course, let me tell you once again, any real estate transaction related question might have application of 50C. So we don't have to be surprised when 50C is there. It is pervasive in this entire chapter. Wherever there is a real estate transaction, 50C application will be there also. So that is the importance of that section 50C. Now moving on to another situation, that is 50CA. Not that important. MCQ can be expected on this, but still only logical thing. In case of unlisted shares which are transferred, unlisted shares, not listed shares. Quoted shares means those which are quoted in the stock market. For them there is no problem because we know the fair market value which is already there in the stock market price. We have to believe that. That cannot be questioned. But if the SSE is selling, in other words transferring a capital asset, what is that? Share of a company which is other than a quoted share. And he is telling that whatever the consideration that the SC has received is less than the fair market value of such share, determined in such a manner as may be prescribed. So all these things are very practically difficult things. Such a manner as may be prescribed, first of all the fair market value of such unlisted share has to be calculated. If by chance the SSE claims that he has received less than the fair market value of such share, then what shall be taken as full value of consideration? Such a fair market value shall be deemed to be the full value of consideration received or accruing as a result of such transfer, even though really he has received a lesser amount of money. Logic wise 50C and 50CA both are same. In case of 50C, SSE said actual consideration received is less than stamp duty valuation, and Income Tax Act relied on stamp duty valuation than what the SSE says, because SSEs can lie. They want to reduce their tax liability. Generally that is a possibility. Nobody will tell all this. The government will not tell all the citizens that you are all criminals, that is why we have Indian Penal Code. No. There might be possibility of crime also. There might be some people who will be indulging into that activities also. So we have to have certain law which will either prevent it, prohibit it, or if somebody does it, there should be a remedy for it. That's what 50C talks about. If the actual consideration is less than stamp duty valuation, we take stamp duty valuation. In case of 50CA, asset here is not a real estate asset, it is unlisted shares. In that case, what will be taken as full value of consideration? Fair market value of such unlisted shares shall be considered to be the full value of consideration if such fair market value is higher than the actual consideration. It can be framed in other way also. where the actual consideration claimed by the SSE is less than the fair market value of such unlisted shares, then also fair market value of such unlisted shares will be taken or deemed to be the full value of consideration. That is 50CA. In case of 50C, we believed in stamp duty valuation. In case of 50CA, we are believing fair market value. What is fair market value? You don't have to worry, I don't have to worry. That will be calculated in accordance with the manner as may be prescribed, whatever it is. That's it. But this dilemma can arrive at any type of other assets also, right? There is always a possibility. Somebody may sell gold ornaments and they say that market value of the gold is 10 grams 40,000. He may say that I just received 5,000 only. He may say that. Anybody can say anything. But will we believe that? No. Like this, any asset people can say actual consideration received is less than fair market value, or consideration is not determinable, I don't know what is the actual consideration. Then the Income Tax Act will simply say, don't worry Baba, take the fair market value of the capital asset on the date of transfer as if it is the sale consideration. That's all. Fair market value is the basis for all types of movable properties, we can say, which are capital assets. For immovable properties, naturally stamp duty valuation is there, which is a legal valuation done by state governments, available on records. For movable properties like shares or any other thing for that matter, 50D is open-ended. If the consideration is not at all determinable in any transaction, any means any, then what should be taken as full value of consideration? Fair market value of such capital asset shall be taken as full value of consideration. So for a immovable property 50C, for unlisted shares it is 50CA, for any asset it is 50D. In all cases, actual consideration may be different, full value of consideration finally to be taken by the Act might be different if fair market value or stamp duty valuation, as the case may be, is more than the original consideration received or claimed to be received by the SSE. That is section 50 series, very important series this one. 50 depreciable assets, 50A depreciable assets of electricity companies, 50B slump sale, very important question that also. 50C, most important section almost in this entire chapter, that is related to immovable properties and stamp duty valuation to be considered. 50CA is only for unlisted shares, maybe for MCQs it is okay, otherwise it is not a very crucial thing for problem solving. 50D is also a very open-ended thing, nothing much special about it. Now let us move on to section 51. This is also an important aspect. Generally any item can be there in any question which can be included like this also. So what can happen here is, sometimes SSE might have some negotiation done for sale of the asset long back, and when he has negotiated with this, the buyer might be interested also. Buyer would have paid the advance money, some bit of token advance, whatever money the buyer of the asset actually would have paid, SSE would have received also, but later some reasons, because of some reasons, that deal did not go through. But what SSE did, he did not refund that money to that buyer of the asset. He forfeited it. Then how to treat that is section 51. So if naturally everything is if only. If any transaction happens like this, then only we will treat it. If any advance money in relation to any capital asset is received and forfeited by the SSE, received and given back, there is no nothing. Received by the SSE, let us say one person came and agreed that he will bring the full money in 1 week, and that person is gayab. What we can do? The advance is forfeited by the SSE. So if money in advance is received by the SSE and forfeited by the SSE, then the amount so forfeited shall be treated like this. How that has to be treated? According to the following table. This table you have to remember. So what is this table telling us? One important aspect here is date. That is up to 2013-14 financial year. In other words, up to 31st March 2014, let us say. If advance money received by the SSE and forfeited, till when? This date you have to remember, very important date, up to 31st March 2014. That means up to the financial year 2013-14. Prior to that, if the advance money was received by the SSE and forfeited, what should happen to that advance money? What is the treatment? That should be reduced from the cost of acquisition or fair market value on 1/4/2001 or return on value of the asset, as the case may be. So that advance money received and forfeited shall be reduced from the cost of acquisition. So cost of acquisition or fair market value or written down value is basically the deduction we are talking. You are reducing something from a deduction means you are making it taxable, but you are making it taxable indirectly, not directly. Indirectly, by reducing such advance amount from this, that amount will become taxable. But there is an unfairness in this. What is that? Advance money might have been received by the SSE in 1 year, but original cost of acquisition could be happening in some other year. But when you reduce it, advance money from that original cost of acquisition, indexation is applicable for this also on an year which may not be exactly related to original cost of acquisition. Let us say SSE has received advance and forfeited in 2012. Asset was originally acquired before 1/4/2001, let us say. When you reduce this advance money from this cost of acquisition, after reduction only you are applying indexation, which means unnecessarily this amount that is going to be taxable because of this reduction from COA will be higher. That will be unfair to the SSE. That is one problem. So that problem is rectified. We don't have to worry. That is rectified for other purposes when advance money is received by the SSE and forfeited after financial year 13-14. In other words, 1/4/2014 onwards. Up to 31st March 2014, advance money received and forfeited shall be reduced from cost of acquisition. Reduced from cost of acquisition. After reducing only indexation should be applied. Then, what if the advance money is forfeited on or after 1/4/2014? Then there is nothing to reduce, nothing to do. Simply that is chargeable to tax under the head of income from other sources. In other words, there is no relationship with capital gains at all, which is correct. Advance money is income. It should be taxable. Why to wait till the SSE sells that asset and then reduce it from the cost of acquisition of the asset while calculating capital gains? That was unnecessary, which was there the treatment earlier. That has been rectified, and now any advance money received and forfeited on or after 1/4/2014 will have to be treated as income from other sources. No need to reduce from cost of acquisition at all. But look at another point. This is also a loophole earlier which was there. Advance money received by previous owner and forfeited, not the SSE, previous owner. Then earlier what was the situation? It was not taxable for previous owner also, and SSE need not reduce it from cost of acquisition also because he did not receive it. That means completely it evaded the tax. Any income completely evading the tax is not a good thing, but it was an unfortunate situation prior to 13-14. If the advance money received and forfeited was by the previous owner up to 31st March 2014, what is the treatment? No treatment. Neither it is taxable for the previous owner, nor it will be deductible from cost of acquisition, indirectly becoming taxable. It is not taxable for SSE also because there is no need to reduce it from cost of acquisition. But once again, this is also rectified. Now, after the 2013-14 financial year, on or after 1/4/2014, if the previous owner forfeits the advance money, that will be treated as income from other sources. Naturally, for whom? Whoever received. Who received? Previous owner received. So naturally, that will be taxable for previous owner under the head income from other sources in that year when he received it. No need of reduction from cost of acquisition in case of SSE because he did not receive it. So that is how advance money received and forfeited either by the SSE or by the previous owner has to be treated. Of course, by the SSE, definitely it has to be reduced from the cost of acquisition if SSE received it prior to 1/4/2014. If the SSE received it on or after 1/4/2014, that will be treated as income from other sources. No reduction from cost of acquisition. If the advance money received and forfeited by previous owner, as far as SSE is concerned, nothing to do with that. Nothing to do. We don't have to do with anything with that. Whether it is before 13-14 also, after 13-14 also, because it is all only possible to be taxed for the previous owner under income from other sources. If we are calculating income of that person also, then it is okay. We have to mention that. Otherwise, for the SSE, there is no impact if advance money received and forfeited by previous owner was there. That's it. Next, let us understand and apply this all provisions, most of them enough actually to start solving some of the capital gains related questions. Let us look at them one by one. Exercise number 10. advise Srimati Megha as to the taxability of the following transactions. A house was purchased on 1/5/2001 during the financial year 2001-2 for 2 lakhs rupees and was used as a residence by the owner. Owner had contracted to sell this property in June 2018 for 10 lakhs and received an advance of 50,000 rupees towards sale. Intending purchaser did not proceed with the transaction and the advance was forfeited by the owner. Property was sold in July 2019 for 15 lakhs. That's it. First point. When the advance money was received, June 2018, that means after 1/4/2014 or not? Yes. So will that advance money have any kind of impact on capital gains? No. But question is, taxability was the question asked. Capital gains was not is asked. So first and foremost point here, 50,000 rupees advance money would be taxable under the head of income from other sources. In which year? When it is received. 18-19 was the year in which it is received. So 2019-20 assessment year, it would have been already taxed. If not also, we will tell that it will be taxed under the assessment year 2019-20 because it was received and forfeited in 2018-19. What was the deal between them? What they negotiated? 10 lakhs, 45 lakhs, 45 crores. How does it matter? When the deal did not happen, that is useless. That is completely immaterial information. That is where our eyes should not go also. 10 lakhs is most useless information in this. 50,000 is taxable under the head of income from other sources for the assessment year 2019-20. Done. That is income from other sources. Now coming to the capital gains. Capital gains we have to calculate by taking the same format, full value of consideration or net sale consideration also, because there is no expenses. Amount is how much? It is sold in July 2019 during our previous year for 15 lakhs. So 15 lakhs is the full value of consideration. That itself is net sale consideration also. From that, let us reduce the indexed cost of acquisition. What was the indexed cost of acquisition? 2 lakhs was the original cost of acquisition of this purchased house. It was not prior to 1/4/2001, but it was during 2001-2. That means still the indexation number is 100 only, because index number for even 2001-2 also is 100. So easily we can take 289 divided by 100. That will be how much? 2 lakhs into 289 by 100 means 5,78,000. That's all. That is the indexed cost of acquisition. Advance and all will not be reduced or anything like that, because that advance is received and forfeited after 1/4/2014. This date you have to remember also. So 5,78,000 minus 15 lakhs. 15 lakhs minus 5,78,000 will be how much? 9,22,000. And what is that? Long-term capital gain. That's it. That is the answer for exercise number 10. Okay. Long-term capital gain of 9,22,000 is taxable. Income from other sources, for that not our previous year or not our assessment year. For the assessment year 1920, 50,000 would have been taxable under income from other sources. That was question number 10. Now let us move on to question number 11. X purchases a house property December 93, much before 1/4/2001, for 5,25,000, and an amount of 1,75,000 was spent on the improvement and repairs of the property in March 98. Provision. Any cost of improvement prior to 1/4/2001 has to be ignored. This 1,75,000 has to be ignored. Important point, that should be written as note also. Property was proposed to be sold to Mr. Z in the month of May 2007, and an advance of 40,000 was taken from him. As the entire money was not paid in time, X forfeited the advance. That means X has forfeited the advance in year 2007-8, which is before 2013-14. That means this 40,000 has to be reduced from cost of acquisition. That is the provision here related to section 51. 51 says clearly, if the advance money received by the SSE and forfeited up to financial year 13-14, that advance shall be reduced from the cost of acquisition. So X has forfeited this advance 40,000, and that is why it has to be reduced from the cost of acquisition of whatever it is. Then what happened after that? X has sold the property to Y, we don't care, in the month of March 2020, naturally during our previous year, for 52 lakhs. That is the full value of consideration. Fair value of the property on April 1st, 2001 was 11 lakhs 90,000. So, original cost of acquisition was 5 lakhs 25,000. Fair market value on 1/4/2001 was 11 lakhs 90,000. Again, another provision you have to write a note on that. We should apply. Whichever is higher has to be taken, ignoring the cost of improvement prior to 1/4/2001. So 525, 175 both are useless. What will be the cost of acquisition for this purpose? 11 lakhs 90,000. What is the capital gain chargeable to tax in the hands of Mr. X for the assessment year 2021? Same full value of consideration. First thing first. How much is that? 52 lakhs. Expenses and all are not there, so directly we don't need to worry about it. That itself will be the net sale consideration also. In exam you can just show expenses in connection with the transfer nil. So we have net sale consideration, same 52 lakhs. Like this you can just increase one step for presentation purposes. It will not give any additional marks, but just looks good that we know the entire format. But the point is, from this we have to reduce indexed cost of acquisition. This is an important aspect. Indexed cost of acquisition should be applied here in applying two different provisions. One provision is, since the asset was purchased prior to 1/4/2001, we have to take fair market value of the property on 1/4/2001, which is 11 lakhs 90,000. But applying section 51, since Mr. X has forfeited some amount which he received as advance in year 2007-8, that should be reduced from the cost of acquisition. How much is the cost of acquisition? 40,000 is the amount. That should be reduced from 11 lakhs 90,000. That means 11 lakhs 50,000 now becomes the cost of acquisition, on which we should apply indexation. Indexation is standard here also, because it is prior to 1/4/2001. So 11 lakhs 50,000 into 289 divided by 100. That comes to how much? 33 lakhs 23,500. Which means, what is the taxable long-term capital gain? 18 lakhs 76,500. That's all. That is the long-term capital gain taxable in the hands of Mr. X. That is the answer for question number 11. That is why each provision, dates and facts of the case have to be observed very, very carefully. Okay, that is question number 11. Then let us move on to question number 12. Read it carefully. Mr. K bought a house property in April 1992, much before 2001, for 65,000. That is the original purchase price. The fair market value of the house property on 1/4/2001 was 2,70,000. Okay, that's fine. On August 31st, 2004, K entered into an agreement with Mr. J for sale of such property for 3,70,000, which is useless, and received an amount of 60,000 as advance. So K entered into an agreement with whom we don't care, J or G or whoever it is. He received and forfeited 60,000 advance. That matters. When is that? 2004-5, much before 2013-14. However, Mr. J did not pay the balance amount and K forfeited the advance. Okay, fine. In May 2019, K constructed the first floor by incurring a cost of 2,35,000 that can be considered as cost of improvement. Subsequently, in January 2010, K gifted the house to his friend Mr. D. So the story is different now. K originally started, the story started with K. He entered into agreement with J and nothing happened. And then K forfeited the advance, so J character is out. K has done some more work on that house and subsequently he gifted this house to Mr. D. And who is our SSC now? K or D? Naturally D, not K. Though the story started with K, K is not our SSC. Our SSC is D. Why? Because he is the one who has sold the house now for 12 lakhs. When K gifted that asset to D, it was not a transfer. It was excluded from the definition of transfer. So K is not at all the SSC. D is the SSC who sold our house in our previous year 2019-20 for 12 lakhs rupees. So full value of consideration. Start with that 12 lakhs rupees. A lot of story is there, but we have to identify exactly the relevant facts. I am not deducting every time expenses and all if they are not there. Then take the indexed cost of acquisition or indexed cost of improvement. Originally, what was the purchase price? Here we have to apply section 49(1) because cost of acquisition in case of gift, in case of asset which is acquired as a gift, will be what? Whatever the cost of acquisition to the previous owner is. Previous owner is K. What was the cost of acquisition for K? 65,000. But since it was before 1/4/2001, we have to take 65,000 or 2,70,000. We have to take 2,70,000 as the cost of acquisition, applying that provision. Fine. Then, when K has forfeited the amount of 60,000 in some year, what was the situation? When previous owner forfeited the advance, according to this table, what should we do? We should not do anything. That has nothing to do with the computation of capital gains of our SSE. It is neither taxable for K also, nor it will be reduced from the cost of acquisition also. It will be gone in the air. So, that 60,000 and K's agreement with J, that entire thing is useless. But of course, you have to write a note for that. Then only you will get marks for that point. So, forfeiture of advance by Mr. K of the money given by Mr. J is neither deductible from cost of acquisition nor taxable in the hands of Mr. K at all. That was the loophole already existing before 2013-14. Since he has forfeited this advance in 2004-5, definitely nothing has to be done by us. Then next question comes. Cost of acquisition 2,70,000, which is okay, which is the fair market value of the property. But 289 is okay. Divided by what? Divided by, should we take 100 or should we take when this house was gifted to Mr. D? Our SSE is D, by the way. 2010 or 910 is the year in which SSE D has first held the asset. So should we take that year's indexation or should we take the year in which the asset was first held by the previous owner? According to Manjula Shah case, we have to take the second one. That means 100 has to be taken as denominator. Applying what? Manjula Shah case. That has to be written also. So 2,70,000 into 289 divided by 100. 7,80,300 is the indexed cost of acquisition. But it is not over. Indexed cost of improvement is also there. Because K constructed a first floor. Even if construction happened, indexed cost of improvement happened by previous owner also, that is deductible. 2,35,000 is the cost of construction of first floor. 289 is okay, but always you have to look at what is the year in which the construction has happened. May 2009 he said. May 2009 means year is 2009-10. What is the indexation for 2009-10? 148. Take that in the denominator. That's it. 2,35,000 into 289 divided by 148. That comes to 4,58,885. So indexed cost of acquisition and indexed cost of improvement, both of them have been deducted here. And once we do that, 12 lakhs minus 7,80,300 minus 4,58,885, we get a long-term capital loss. Anything can come, whatever comes. Sorry, not gain, loss. Long-term capital loss. 39,185 is the long-term capital loss in the hands of who? Who is the SSE? SSE is D, not K. K story is over. D is the SSE who has sold this property now, and for him, full value of consideration is 12 lakhs. Indexed cost of acquisition related to previous owner has to be taken. Indexed cost of improvement for previous owner also is okay, which can be taken here. Then long-term capital loss has happened because of that. That is answer for 12th question. Now moving on to question number 13. Rajkumar sold a house to his friend Mr. Dhruv on 1st November 2019 for a consideration of 25 lakhs. Sub-registrar refused to register the document for the said value, as according to him the stamp duty value has to be paid on 45 lakhs. That is a stamp violation according to him, according to the stamp violation authority, who is the sub-registrar, which was the government guideline value. Rajkumar preferred an appeal to the RDO, Revenue Divisional Officer, who fixed the value of the house as 32 lakhs. So violation officer is who here? That RDO, whoever he may be. For us, it is violation officer. 32 lakhs is the value fixed by valuation officer, which is in between actual consideration and stamp duty valuation. So what has to be taken? Definitely 32 lakhs has to be taken as full value of consideration, but identify this clearly. How much is that for land and how much is for building, that has been bifurcated. So we have to do the calculation also separately. When it is not possible to separate them, we cannot. Then when it is possible to know what is the full value of consideration for land and building separately, we should do separately. So 22 lakhs is the full value of consideration for land, and naturally remaining means 10 lakhs is the full value of consideration for building. That's it. And differential stamp duty was paid, accepting the said value determined. Of course, they have no choice, they will do that. They did it. Assuming that the fair market value is 32 lakhs, it doesn't matter, that is useless. Fair market value, who cares? When it comes to immovable properties, we only care about stamp duty valuation or valuation officer's report. Unnecessary information will be given to confuse, that is useless. Even if it is 30 lakhs, 40 lakhs, whatever it is, we don't care. What are the tax implications in the hands of Mr. Rajkumar for the assessment year 2020-21? Of course, Rajkumar purchased the land on 1st June 2013 for 5 lakhs 19,000 and completed the construction of the house on 1st October 2017 for 8 lakhs. So we have the cost of acquisition for separately each of them. So let us take land first. 5 lakhs 19,000 into 289 divided by which year is that? 1st June 2013 means 2013-14. 13-14 indexation is 220. That is the indexed cost of acquisition for land. So 5 lakhs 19,000 into 289 divided by 220. That will be 6 lakhs 81,777 approximately. No need of decimals and all. Then what about building? Building was completed on 1st October 2017. First of all, look at this. Whether it has completed 24 months or not. It is a short-term capital asset or long-term capital asset. That also has to be kept in mind. 2017 October to 2018 October 2018 to October 2019. It was sold on 1st November 2019. It has crossed 24 months. Which means it is a long-term capital asset. Which means it is eligible for indexation. How much is that indexation and all? 8 lakhs. Into 289 is common normally, divided by what? Which year building was completed? 2017 means 2017-18. So 17-18 was 272. That's all. So 8 lakhs into 289 divided by 272, that will be 8 lakhs 50,000. So what is the long-term capital gain? Both are long-term only here. Land was clearly long-term. Even building is long-term because it is held for more than 24 months since it is an immovable property. So 24 months is the criteria. So for building it is clear 1,50,000 is the long-term capital gain. For land you calculate that carefully. 22 lakhs minus 681,777. That will be 15 lakhs 18,223. Total. Final answer. You can conclude the final answer. The long-term capital gain total is how much? 16 lakhs 68,223 is the long-term capital gain that is taxable in the hands of Mr. Rajkumar. That's what is asked. That's it. That was question number 13. It was an exam question, and look at the importance of this. It was asked again in the exam also. So exercise number 14, this is your, you can say, homework. You have to do this exercise number 14. You do that. Exercise number 14 separately. Same question as 13. Only just amounts changed. Other things are all mostly same. And these were all, both of them, 13 and 14 were asked in past exams. So 13 we have done. 14 you do it. Then let us do 15 also. 15. Anshu transfers land and building on 2/1/2020 and furnishes the following information. Compute capital gains. Net consideration received is 14 lakhs. Value adopted by Stamp Valuation Authority is 23 lakhs. Value ascertained by the valuation officer on reference by assessing officer is 24 lakhs. So which one we should take? 23 lakhs we should take. So full value of consideration or directly net sale consideration is 23 lakhs. Land was acquired by Anshu on 1/4/2001. Fair market value of the land on 1/4/2001 was 1 lakh. So simply just a straightforward calculation. 1 lakh into 289 by 100. Naturally that will be 2,89,000. That is indexed cost of acquisition. Then a residential building was constructed on this land by Anshu at a cost of 320,000. Construction completed in which year? 2004-5. 1/12/2004 means 4-5. So take the cost first. 3,20,000 into 289 divided by what? You have to refer to table. There is no option. Of course, in the exam it will be given. So which year we are talking about? Year 2004-5 financial year. 45113 was the indexation number. 113. Right? 2004-5 113 was the indexation number. Correct. So 113 is the denominator. Take that. So 3,20,000 into 289 divided by 113. 8,18,407 is the indexed cost of improvement, we can say. Now, why did we take land and building separately here, but here we are not taking separately? Because there the value was available separately, given in the question. Here it is not given in the question. When a building is sold, land under it also will be sold automatically. If you can separate it, if it is given in the question, we can separate it. Otherwise, you don't need to. Land is cost of acquisition, building can be taken as construction as cost of improvement. So with that, we can find out what is the long-term capital gain taxable in the hands of Anshu. So 23 lakhs minus 2,89,000 minus 818,407, that will give 11,92,593. That is the long-term capital gain taxable in the hands of Anshu. That is exercise number 15. With that, we can conclude today's session. These are the major questions which were asked in exams also. Already we have entered into the exam type questions. All the provisions so far, whatever we have discussed, all of them are very important for application of them in the examination. Of course, amalgamation, demerger, those big things may not be applied in these problems. Those may be given for MCQ separately. Anything related to companies can be considered to be an MCQ possibility. Anything normally related and applicable to even an individual normal person also, that can be definitely expected to be asked in the questions. All the provisions so far which are related to that will have to be thoroughly remembered and applied in these cases, and practice these questions. Don't just look and watch at this problem solving and think that you learned something. That is only part of the learning. When you do these same questions once again on your own after this class being attended to, and you also get the same answer what you saw in the class, then you can say yes, you got the correct understanding of how to solve these questions. And in addition to that, also solve question number 14, which is a repetition of 13 only, just given in another exam with different names. That's all. With that, we'll conclude this session and we'll discuss some more provisions of this capital gains head of income in the next session. Till then, take care. Bye bye. Thank you very much.